Welcome, everyone. My name is Bethany Mackey. I'm the executive director here at Progressive Multiplier, and I'm so glad you're joining us for today's conversation. At Progressive Multiplier, we get to work with movement organizations that are building durable, mission-aligned revenue, not as a side hustle, not as a replacement for philanthropy, but as one path towards greater financial resilience, self-determination, and power. And today's conversation, I'm so excited to dig into, is really a case study in what that journey to financial resilience actually takes. Just Safe Food started as an idea inside One Fair Wage. What if the legally required food safety training that millions of workers have to take every year could become something different? What if it could be worker designed and mission aligned, lower cost, and a real revenue engine for worker power, instead of sending money back into a lobbying apparatus that fights against wage increases for workers? Progressive Multiplier was introduced to this project very early on in its development. Our role was not to provide full-scale capital. It was to act as an early thought partner and R&D funder to help One Fair Wage test whether this idea for Just Safe Food held water. So we got to dig into questions like, was there a real market? Was there a revenue opportunity connected to the mission? Could One Fair Wage's really unique assets like its worker base, its restaurant relationships, its policy expertise and public trust become a real advantage? And what would it take to actually take this from great idea that held water to a viable enterprise? So early Kickstart grants like this one matter because independent revenue generation requires a continuum of capital. So there's early money, like this grant that lets an organization explore and validate an idea. And then there's larger capital required to build the product, hire the team, grow the sales, and scale the enterprise, which is what Just Say Food is doing today. So that's the story we're really going to unpack this afternoon. I want to start by helping the audience understand the people and structures in this story. When the panelists got together for a prep conversation, we talked about this being a really interesting trifecta of folks. So Saru as the originator and movement leader, Taj as someone who brings capital and a venture building lens really rooted in organizing, and Ben as the operator and the part of the team that's helping move Just Safe Food into its next stage. So I'm going to ask each of you panelists to introduce yourselves, but not just with the standard bio. I'd really like you to each add on what role you play in this story. So Saru, let's start with you. What was your role in imagining Just Safe Food, and why did the idea emerge from One Fair Wages work?
Thank you so much, Bethany, for doing this. We so appreciate you all and your early support. Yeah, so we've been fighting to raise the minimum wage for 25 years, literally. This year is our 25th anniversary since 9/11. And throughout that time, the National Restaurant Association, which we call the other NRA, which is a very big, powerful, ugly, vicious, bullying trade lobby that put my children's pictures up on attack websites and sent me death threats and sent people to my home to scare my family. Um, they've been fighting us for 25 years because they don't want wages to go up. And in 2018, it got particularly vicious at a time when some of their attacks on me were particularly vicious. Somebody inside the Restaurant Association caught a conscience and leaked me some emails I wasn't supposed to see that showed where they were bragging to each other, the leadership of the Restaurant Association. Oh, we don't even pay for this lobbying against wage increases. Turns out in the emails, the majority of their $80 million a year lobbying budget comes from a company they created called ServSafe, where they have gone around the country in the name of public health and food safety, passing laws requiring workers to take food handler training, and then they have the monopoly food safety training company. Now, mind you, all the information in this training is free on the CDC website. It is pretty common sense information: wear gloves, heat food at a certain temperature. But they've just found a way to make money off of 14 million workers who annually are paying for training that is then used to lobby against their wage increase without workers knowing about it. So when we saw this, we said this is both sadistic and genius, because it is obviously horrible, but a very easy way to bring in millions and millions of dollars from low wage workers. And so we exposed it, of course. We got a big New York Times article I put in the chat exposing it, but we thought, what if we were to create an alternative worker-owned food safety training company where it would be not only about revenue generation, but about building power, taking money away from the Restaurant Association and bringing it to the worker movement.
Thanks, Saru. Taj, I'm going to kick it to you. What is the Venture Studio's role in this story, and what does it mean to help incubate a mission-aligned business like Saru was describing?
Yeah, so great to be with all of you. A quick story on sort of how found myself in this role. Um, Spent 20 years at the Movement Strategy Center, and a big part of what MSC did was sort of build and incubate coalitions and alliances working for social justice and providing often infrastructure for fiscal sponsorship and launching a new initiative. So I sort of found myself supporting community leaders and movement partners who want to build stuff to help provide infrastructure to make the building of stuff easier. And in the course of doing that work for a couple decades, kind of found ourselves where Progressive Multiplier found itself being like, oh, well, our movement partners are really good at passing laws and policies and shifting hearts and minds and changing culture, but we don't really have a strategy to build economic power at scale. And we need that because to transform systems, we need integrated political power, cultural power, and economic power. And so, incubated Full Spectrum Labs at MSC, it spun out and is now the Full Spectrum Group, which kind of works to um, help workers and communities build economic power. And so, a part of the work in Full Spectrum Labs is um, incubation, acceleration, and then also a venture studio. And that's where we've incubated internally a social enterprise called Blueprint, which is a capital matching platform that we built out to kind of help try to get more resources to folks more easily. And then, Saru, who's a good friend and comrade for many years, reached out and said, "Hey, we've got this thing, and it's at this really exciting moment where we've got a product, and we've got it certified, and we've got a lot of traction, um, but we need to sort of build a business around the product, and we need to build a team around that, and that's sort of what makes a studio a studio. A studio is a business and team building process, and so." Uh, yeah, jumped in and then brought in Ben from our team to who stepped in to kind of help get the business going to the next phase and stage. And I'll pass to Ben to kind of share a little bit about how he came in and the role he's playing.
Great. Thanks, Taj. Yeah, so I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Just.Safe.Food. So, as Taj mentioned, my job is to turn this promising idea and this product into a profitable enterprise. My career has been at the intersection of advocacy and entrepreneurship. So, I spent many years at the National NAACP and then many more years at Village Capital, which supports mission-driven startups in areas like economic mobility and workforce development. And I'm also an entrepreneur. And so, what excited me about Just Say Food is that it's where all these worlds met. It's a movement organization that identified a real market opportunity. And, my role is to keep the ball rolling on operations day to day and to build a team around the business.
Thanks, Jill. So, as you can tell, audience, we've got quite a cast of leaders here. One Fair Wage brought the movement insight and the worker trust and the relationships and the urgency of the moment. Just Say Food is the enterprise being built, and the Venture Studio is helping support that next stage of incubation. Um, let's go really briefly back to the beginning. What is most useful for this audience to note in our discussion here is the pattern, how a movement organization identifies a real revenue opportunity, what makes it worth testing, and what needs to become clear as you move from testing an idea to actually thinking through enterprise building. So, Sarah, you talked a little bit about why this project. Um, what At what point did this feel like a mission-aligned revenue opportunity rather than just a side project?
Yeah, it's interesting. We started this work in 2001, and we didn't learn about Just Say Food till 2018. So for 17 years, like every other nonprofit, we were thinking about, is there any way to create revenue? And we, tried different things. We started our own worker-owned restaurants that were crazy capital intensive and very difficult. We we actually looked into a loan fund because we've talked to other nonprofits that generated revenue that way. We were even exploring crazy things like, food trucks and catering. We
Hmm.
had a catering business for a while because we're restaurant workers. All of those were wrong for different reasons. They were capital intensive. They took time and money away from and resources away from the mission. Um, what was different about hitting upon this information from the National Restaurant Association is, one, there's no capital. It's completely online. It's free. I mean, it's not free to set up and manage, but God, compared to a restaurant, is it so low capital? And then two, it wasn't just about money. The potential to actually build power and organize workers, because if 14 million workers are currently using Just Say Food, I'm sorry, ServeSafe, if we could even get a quarter of them to switch to Just Say Food, we'd be the largest worker organization or union in the United States of America. Currently, the largest union, NEA, is 3 million members. If we got a quarter of the 14 million restaurant workers to just switch to a cheaper food safety training, we would instantly be creating the largest power base of workers in the country. So it was about both the fact that it was so low capital and easy compared to all the other revenue generating ideas we had, but also that the power building opportunity made it not a side project, but the whole
Hmm.
thing, like the entire way that we could have power to do our mission, which is to raise wages and improve working conditions and change the balance of power between restaurant workers and employers. It was so central. It was so it is, frankly, at this point, we're seeing it as the whole future of the organization.
So I hear you on the low capital, easy, but I feel like there's a nuance that's worth digging into here in that given the work that One Fair Wage does, you brought a really unique understanding of the food service ecosystem. How did that knowledge from your primary purpose work actually feed into making this opportunity visible early for you?
Well, the crazy thing is that because we're a base building organization, and one of the ways we've learned to build the restaurant worker base is by offering training and services to bring people in and get them involved in the movement. We had actually offered ServeSafe training at our organization for years. So we were paying the enemy without knowing that that was the enemy. Um, so um, when we found out about it, we knew what ServeSafe was. We knew how important it was to workers. We knew how we were able to talk to workers about their experience of being told before they even start the job, you have to take ServeSafe. We knew the monopoly, we knew who the owner was. We knew everything about the power analysis behind the whole company. So it was very quick for us to figure
Mhm.
out how to build an alternative.
Got it. And one of the things we're always trying to notice when we work with groups like yours is where a movement organization has a real market advantage because it's of its power analysis, its expertise, the trust it's built, its proximity to the front line. And I want to name something right now that I think is important, especially for the practitioners on this call, is that not every organization has a national market opportunity in front of it. And that's 100% okay. For some groups, a $500,000 or $1 million revenue line could be transformational. So the lesson that we're hoping you take away from this conversation isn't that everyone should just build something like Just Safe Food, but the lesson is where does your organization have a mission aligned advantage that could support earning durable revenue? So, Taj, I want to turn to you from where you sit now. What do you, what do you look for when deciding whether something is just a good idea or whether it could become a scalable, investable revenue model like Just Say Food?
Yeah, I think for us, we're thinking about what it takes to create real transformation. And so looking for opportunities where, as you know, sorry, just said, the the fundraising becomes organizing, right? Providing services becomes organizing. Providing a product becomes organizing so that you're building like relationships, connection, community, shared consciousness, shared focus, right? Like the basis of our power is our solidarity, our connection, and our sense of a shared vision that we're moving towards together, right? So there's oftentimes as political organizers, we kind of aren't paying attention to those opportunities and they're sort of right, right in front of us. I mean, I think this is it's a little bit of a tangent, but um, the World Cup is here, you know, Working Families Party has a has a very interesting creator strategy. You think about create the creator economy, right? You go in, you build content, you create an audience, right? You engage people. And what conservatives have done so well is most of the time, 90% of the time, they're not talking about politics. 10% of the time they talk about politics. And they actually are really good at building deeper and broader engagement by just engaging people around things that are important in their daily lives. And then having the politics be a layer in that. Whereas, for progressives and folks on the left, we generally have that flipped the other way. It's like 90% the politics and, oh wait, we forgot to provide childcare for the meeting, or oh wait, we forgot to, we forgot we forgot the food. I mean, I'm exaggerating to make the point, but I think um, we're looking for opportunities first where the relationship building, the power building impacts associated with the economic activity are significant. Um, let's see. So it's kind of mission aligned, impact aligned, and sort of as you said, Sarah, as well, like the underlying economics work because the other tension here, just to name, there's two big kind of mistakes the group often falls into. As a community organizer, I'm an organizer. So wherever I'm doing, I'm organizing. If I'm organizing money, I'm just organizing. Because you're an organizer, you're always organizing. So but sometimes the organizer mindset is like, because I'm an organizer, I think organizers should do everything. I think the organizer should be the accountant. I think the organizer should be the fundraiser. I think because I'm an organizer, I'm in love with organizers. I think organizers should do everything. As opposed to like, get the person who's a good accountant to be an accountant. So what that means is we tend to try to like have our power building organizations like take responsibility for functions that are not our core area of expertise. And that can pull resources and energy away from our core activities. And then it becomes a debate in the organization like, wait, why are we spending time trying to build food trucks when we should just be, and then that can become a tension. So one of the great things about the moment that we're in is more and more organizations are figuring out how to kind of build additional capacities through certain kinds of partnerships with organizations that already have some capacity in the area that they're focused on. So it doesn't pull away from the core mission and focus of the core work. And you see this a lot in terms of just like in a community development context, right? We need to build housing and we need to do urban agriculture. We need all these things, but we're an organizing group trying to build policy systems change stuff. We don't know how to build houses. And those housing people didn't support us on our tax the rich campaign we brought to city council last week, right? So there's also like can be political misalignment between that sort of economic actors and then the political actors. So I'll pause there, but like so we're looking for places where the political strategy can be the clear compass and driver for the economic strategy, and you're doing it in a way that it strengthens the core organizing capacity and doesn't like weaken it. And as you noticed, like I didn't say very much about capital intensity or rate of return. I didn't say anything. I haven't said anything yet that's really business associated because these are the other things that kind of like kill you before you get started. And you got to line those things, you got to check those things first to then see, okay, like now is there a business here that's going to be sustainable or profitable? And sometimes it's just like, hey, this business is not just going to break even. It's not going to make a lot of extra money, but sometimes for the impact purpose, like it's totally worth it. Whereas in this case, wow, this business both has like significant impact potential, but it also has a potential to generate a lot of surplus revenue that can be reinvested into the political strategy and into into education and services for members and
Hmm.
21st century hiring halls and all kinds of great ideas to build on the work that One Fair Wage has been doing for the last 25 years.
Yeah, appreciate that. So Taj, you talked about what you're looking for to drive that sustainability and profitability. And there's a step before that where I think we can call in our partners in philanthropy who are on this call, um, where they can play a very specific and catalytic role in revenue diversification for movement groups. And that's investing in places like Workers Lab or Progressive Multiplier, where there is this growing ecosystem of revenue generation infrastructure for the movement where they can help early investors deploy capital and provide more context by spotting those promising opportunities and really supporting that uncertain R&D stage where you're trying to figure out, like, before you're talking about profitability, like, is there anything here? And then translating that for larger funders, for venture firms of what that next stage capital need is. Um, so Saru, I wanted, and I know we're going to lose you at the top of the hour, so I wanted to make sure that we got to talk about this. Um, Tell us about what the sort of capital, the different types of capital along the way have meant to One Fair Wage and to Just Save Food in terms of testing to validation and early stage, and then now to where you are.
Yeah. Well, things moved very slowly for several years after we learned about this because we just didn't have the capacity to focus on it. Uh, so early stage gave us some amount of capacity to just think about it, explore the possibility, do early things like, start the process of getting accredited as a national food safety training provider. Think about the web platform that it would be on. So one of the early stage donors actually helped us set up the web platform, that the learning management software for the training. I think with Progressive Multiplier Fund in particular, what it helped us think about is, okay, there's this market of 14 million workers. How do we reach them? And one of the things we learned from that grant that you gave us was it's actually not going to be that impactful or effective to start by trying to just reach 14 million workers broadly. We should be thinking about, for example, counties that already have a contract with ServSafe, get them to remove ServSafe as a provider and instead replace it with Just.Safe.Food. LA County, for example, has 1 million restaurant workers. If LA County switched from ServSafe to Just.Safe.Food, that would be 1 million out of the 14 million workers that would come to us and would create an enormous amount of revenue. So I think early stage capital helped us set up the systems and figure out what the best way to approach it would be. And then the next step was bringing in somebody like Taj and Ben to think about, okay, now let's drive it forward, you know?
Appreciate that, Saru. And Ben, when we see where Just Safe Food is now and that driving forward, so talk about the early piece of what infrastructure had to exist before this could really become a business, so that sort of seminal time between, we've got an idea, we've got an approach, so a little bit beyond concept, and sort of a very early product. Where do you go then? What's the infrastructure look like?
Sure. So when the venture studio joined, first thing we did was some more analysis. So, Taj was saying you can start and then kind of do the business part later. We did the business part, we did the math, built a financial model, checked out that the numbers worked, and they do. And then the next thing was to build the team. And Taj made a good point earlier that the specialized expertise is, I think, something that is easy to get wrong. So for us, that meant, we have invested in products, in operations, sales, marketing, regulatory expertise, all before meaningful revenue has arrived, right? So for instance, just on the product side, we've brought in specialists in product development, in instructional design, which I didn't know that was a thing, but it's very much, if you're teaching, there's a whole group of people who know how to design instructional materials. folks who have food safety expertise, an advisory board made up of both workers and food safety specialists. And I think the key thing here is these have several of these people are on the team, are here working every day. Others are contractors that are sort of coming in with acupuncture, getting a problem unstuck or getting a job done. Um, so yeah, building the team, I think, was the next really important step.
And I think one
Awesome.
of the things that, Ben's written a great book, and he as a social entrepreneur built this great project called Proximate, which is you should all check out and see some of his other work. But Ben's also a great storyteller, and as most people here understand, there's storytelling is core to resource flow, right? Whether you're writing grants or trying to bring other capital into this project. And I think part of what we're also calculating with an effort like this is like sort of like what's the capacity to bring in more grant resources into a social enterprise being launched by a nonprofit organization or a union or another social purpose organization. And so like how much grant of it resources might be available. And then once you sort of get out of that, for us, for a project like this, you're going from grants into recoverable grants and very low interest debt, right? Because core to our vision for economic justice and transition is both a living wage for all and better wages and working conditions for all workers and guaranteed income and basic income. We got a lot of things we need to do around that, but it's also about the ownership economy. It's about workers being owners, and it's about workers and communities owning a much larger percentage of the work that happens in their workplaces and in the overall economy as well. So what shapes the ownership equation is the percentage of charitable capital grants and low interest debt that you can bring into a project. Essentially, what that buys is worker ownership. It buys community ownership. So in any business model I'm looking at, if I say, okay, we need this business needs about $3 to $4 million in resources to get to sustainability or profitability. If we can pull all of that in grants, that directly converts to worker ownership and equity. If we can't bring it all in grants, then we essentially try to bring it in debt, which basically gives the business more time to get to sustainability without giving up equity ownership to investors. And
Hmm.
then the last case scenario is if we're going to give up some equity to investors, like can we bring in Center for Community Change's endowment as an investor, right? So we'll have the nonprofits invest, we'll have the foundations invest, and then we'll have the foundations give back their equity to communities later. So you kind of see where we're going with this. Like we're trying to, and Progressive Multiplier is such a critical part of the beginning of this cycle. And in this case, the Tali Foundation came in and provided a big chunk to sort of the runway that the venture studio has used to kind of get the business built and to an investable stage was really made possible through a pretty significant grant from Katali. And they're often, if you know Katali Foundation, they're often the
Hmm.
ones who unfortunately bring in the big grant to take a project like this from here to there. And the biggest challenge in the philanthropic marketplace is there's currently only one Katali.
Yes.
And if we had five more of those, let me tell you, like the worker and community ownership movement would just would explode in the best possible way because they are often the other people come in, but they can come in at a scale that generally other folks can't. And so for philanthropic institutions, for impact investors, for DAF holders, right? We really want to, all that trillions of dollars are sitting in DAFs. The more of that we can convert into this kind of worker and community ownership capital, where there are opportunities like this, we can make them happen. We can scale them up.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Taj. In talking about the ownership equation, and it makes me think about something you said earlier about sort of the scarcity mindset that we bring as folks who are entrenched in sort of the nonprofit patterns of thinking of like going to hire organizers to do everything. So how do you, and we know there's only one Katali, and that the ecosystem that's funding this between kicking the tires and actually building the business then to be able to take it to a scalable point. It's a right now a limited piece of the capital stack. Um, and so when we think about how do you work with executive directors or folks who are in this in between stage, where they're sort of crippled by this scarcity mindset pattern thinking, and then there's also these aren't folks who have been trained to build a business. So they don't know what they need to bring in. So I know when we started our LLC, things like tax strategy and registered agents and all of that was a whole new ballgame for me. So how do you work with folks like Saru or the executive directors that are on this phone to get them out of that scarcity pattern and get them educated to business building? Taj, you are on mute, my friend.
I'm sort of before I get to that, I just want to say there's critical work to do on all sides because I'll say that we have a smaller problem with organizers and community leaders and movement leaders kind of understanding that revenue can be a good thing and but the bigger challenge often is with this sort of philanthropic mindset
Hmm.
because there's this perception in social change philanthropy that like nonprofits are good and making money is bad. Right? It's bad to make money. The problem with that is it is if you scratch underneath that, like philanthropy is sort of built on this system of dependency and control. Because what happens when communities and organizations generate independent revenue and grow assets is like they don't need philanthropy that much or as much,
Hmm.
right? So that relationship of control and dependency shifts, which I would say philanthropy deep in its heart is like deeply ambivalent about. Even large parts of social change philanthropy are deeply ambivalent about um, moving out of that relationship of dependency and sort of stuck in this mindset of like, I give grants, I'm a good person who does things with philanthropy versus hmm, philanthropy is less than 1% of all global capital. We can't create a new just economic system with philanthropy. You
Just
can't grant
philanthropy.
your
Yep.
way to economic transformation. It's not going to happen. It's mathematically impossible.
Hmm.
So anyway, this is kind of why I started doing what I'm doing because I'm like, okay, it's kind of silly. We're trying to use the smallest amount of money in the whole capital system to change the biggest things and solve the hardest problems. The math doesn't work.
Yep.
So
The math
anyway,
does not
so
math there.
but I would say like for folks like Saro, it's like it is the existence of Progressive Multiplier Project because then it's like, yo, your development director or your fundraising team's like, hey, did you know there's money out here? If we like have an idea, that thing we are talking about in the member meeting yesterday, a member raised their hand and had an idea about a revenue thing, and we can get a little bit of money to try that idea. We can like bring that member in, get them working on it. We can test it out. We can see if there's something there. And if there is, great. Right. So I think just having a little bit of that kind of having the essential role you play of like having resources for an early idea with some potential that you can try and test is a great kind of opportunity opener. I think the other thing is just, opportunities like this. Like you can hear your colleagues and comrades come on and share share their experiences and be inspired by the peers that you respect, right? Like we hadn't really thought about that, but now we're thinking about it. And there's so many examples of this, like Real People's Fund in Oakland, where organizing
Hmm.
groups came together to create a fund to support small businesses as a political organizing strategy to try to build a small business bloc to advocate for progressive tax policy in city council and fight against, big box stores and whatever. So, uh, the organizing and labor movement has gotten real creative about this. Ben shared some example in the chat of where some labor unions in the Northwest like really took this idea very far down the road, and they've been advising us, and they're a part of helping One Fair Wage think about kind of how to apply some of the lessons that have been moved forward in this labor movement example and this labor union example to kind of the community nonprofit infrastructure, worker infrastructure context, some sort of worker center um, context. So yeah, I think those are the two biggest things. Having a little bit of money to start and like getting inspired by your peers who've had some
Hmm.
success, going down this path.
Awesome. And in terms of inspiration from your peers, everybody who is on this call will see in their inbox tomorrow an extensive case study we did on Just Safe Food, where we'll talk about the lessons learned, like building in more time for regulatory and approval processes, and securing adequate resources beyond the first grant, and how to put together real marketing infrastructure. So be on the lookout for that. Um, Ben, I want to bring you in to the conversation on talking about where Just Say Food is today. So obviously we want to stay out of sensitive details and not go too deep into accreditation or public sector strategy, but I want to focus on the practical, like business building questions that are useful for this audience. So things like product, buyer, user, sales pathways, growth strategy. So where do you see Just Say Food in this continuum of growth? We've talked a lot about the early days and securing the capital, but what concretely has happened in the last 6 months, and what's looking ahead in the next few months?
Sure. So yeah, we've done a lot in just 6 months. I was reflecting. I don't love the term move fast and break things, but I do think the first part is right. I think move fast is the reality for startups, in this pre-seed stage. So 6 months ago, we had a hypothesis, right? There might be a market, workers might want an alternative. One fair wage might have an advantage, and we had it, right? So now we have evidence. We have this product exists on a best-in-class learning management system that we picked out. Our accreditation is there. The team exists. I say it's like the gumball machine is there. We need the coin to put in the machine, so the gumball comes out. We have initial customers. Folks have used it and already given us feedback, and we now have the capital strategy and the financial forecast. So now we're building that engine, right? Where we are building the go-to-market strategy. We've already started with our very lean team to have dozens of conversations with potential customers. Um, and we're now building out our capital stack. So yeah, we've shifted from moving can this exist to building the infrastructure, and now growing the capital.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I can't overestimate how powerful it's been to get, especially advice from our partners in the labor movement in terms of what the hard
Hmm.
lessons they learned of doing something very, very similar because one of the early there's a way in which like this opportunity is very simple because you have one product, but then as you get into it more, you're like, oh, the market's actually complex because you like every school, every university, every institution, public institutions, private institutions, small
Hmm.
restaurants, big restaurants. You're like, oh, it's actually it's not so simple as just,
Right.
workers and workplaces, right? So then there's the like, okay, within that, where's the focus? Where do you start? Where do you segment? And as Cyrus said, like, do you kind of try to reach workers broadly and generally? Do you work in key states and geographies? So I would say a lot of um, time and attention went to kind of getting clear on what the range of possibilities are and figuring out where the right strategic focus would be so that this thing can start generating revenue fast enough to essentially like unlock the low cost debt that we have to bring in next. So, and you have to get enough
Hmm.
revenue going fast enough so that when someone takes this through lending diligence, not just the projections are there, but you got enough early revenue to say, okay, this is something that it makes sense to lend money into. So, yeah, a lot of yeah, a lot of the challenge was just kind of narrowing down, like focusing and narrowing on the
Hmm.
many possibilities. Because the other thing I'll say about this is that this is one of what will be many products. And people use this example often, but you think about, okay, Google started with search, and then they did a bunch of things after search. the food safety certification training is the first product of what would be many, because as this thing grows, there's a bunch of other products and service opportunities that once people have a relationship to this in the way that they're going to have a relationship to it, because you can access it directly in the website and you can access it through your employers, and but you're also going to be access it through an app that has other products and services for the member workers within um, One Fair Wage and Service-Worker United. So part of it too is sort of not getting ahead of ourselves and not trying to build too many things too fast, launch too many products too soon, but really figuring out the thing that if we kind of with discipline and a laser focus make this one product work really, really well, then
Hmm.
that'll help with the sequencing of the other products that might get launched later. Um,
Can either of you speak to what the thought process that somebody could take away in terms of vetting those options? Because like the problem is rarely that there's not the good idea, right? It's which idea is going to turn revenue first and unlock the debt that you need to take on and that kind of thing. So is there how do you balance looking at those opportunities? Is it just a how fast they will turn revenue, or is there an offer to audience mapping that you do? What does that process look like?
oh, Go ahead, Ben. I would sort of say I'll say what the first thing is, which is the benefit of, One Fair Wage being a membership organization is which approach is going to be most significant and immediate benefit to our members and other workers like our members. So that's always the first filter for
Perfect.
every question, as it
Mhm.
should be. And then it sort of goes from there. But I'll have Ben, you can sort of add what some of the considerations are beyond there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've learned in these past few months is when you're building a go-to-market strategy, it's all about finding a repeatable process that you can do over and over and over again, right? And so I think we are going to get to this, but basically we see sort of three concurrent layers for how we'll grow. Sort of the biggest one in the middle is enterprise sales. Small, restaurants, sure, but selling to chains like Kava or big, institutions like community colleges or Costco, right? So enterprise sales, we're sort of going to work our way up to. There's this higher level of working with states, counties, governments, basically, some of what Sarah mentioned, but also partnerships with different cities and counties. And then this sort of drumbeat or heartbeat on the lower level of sort of grassroots, just all the interactions that worker organizers who are in the One Fair Wage network can have. Taj's thing is we need to have a card that people just walk out to their restaurant and say, "Hey, do you want to switch over to ServSafe?" That's not going to make us $1 million in 1 year, but over 10 years, that's a lot of people having a lot of small conversations. And that's the heart of organizing, right?
Hmm.
And so for each of those three pathways, we have started to so we started with a lot of trying stuff out, literally going to the restaurant down the street and having a conversation, calling up a few friendly enterprises. And then now we're getting more specific and scientific about what does this repeatable process look like? What does that mean for marginal cost? And starting to put some more specifics around all that.
Great. I want to get specific about payment structure as part of this, because that's one of the most practical questions for other organizations, and it's definitely one of the ones that we deal with most in the R&D stage. So, Ben, what have you learned so far about how you're setting a price for the different products that's both values aligned and financially viable in terms of balancing accessibility for workers, competitiveness with the incumbent, and then that need to generate the early revenue to unlock the next phase of capital?
Sure, it's still something we're figuring out. I think what Sarah said earlier about the competitive advantages that One Fair Wage brings, that's a really key piece of this venture studio, which is that we're excited to be working with movement organizations that have that built in. It's a couple things. It's built-in distribution, which speaks to marketing, which speaks to growth, built-in trust with their customers, built-in reputation and brand. In the corporate world, you can have a brand that's worth several $1 billion just because people recognize the name. And in our case,
Mhm.
people like the work that One Fair Wage does. So most companies have to spend enormous amounts of money acquiring customers, building trust. One Fair Wage has spent years building relationships with workers and employers. That definitely does not eliminate the need for a sustainable business model, but it does give us advantages that help us compete. So I think that's that. So price is something, we're undercutting the monopoly competitor by a bit. We think we can make that up in our agility, in those assets and advantages that I mentioned. And I will say it's never off the table since we're talking about philanthropy, to be subsidized in part, like a small percentage by philanthropy for, let's say, work. This is where it's not a key part of the business model, but when it comes to the mission, right? If there are workers who can't afford to take the test, that could be a piece of it, right? That we can make sure that we're reaching those hard to reach employees. So yeah, that's also a piece of it.
Okay, great. I want to pivot us a little bit from the business model to the capital model. Talking about the capital is our happy place here at Progressive Multiplier. So, um, one of the things that we've learned from this case study and many others is that, often the problem that we run into isn't the business model, isn't the ideas, it's the capital stack and the capital continuum. So, um, what does Just Safe Foods capital need look like now? What is the mix that you're building and why? And then how do you pitch things differently, from that early stage and looking more for straight up grant funding to what you're looking for now in terms of a debt partner? And that can be to Ben or to Tosh.
Yeah, happy to share in general kind of how we're looking at that. I think, and this is another thing I will say is an interesting opportunity and challenge, right? So, uh, as I said before, like when you're building a business that's kind of being spun out of a nonprofit or a union or a tribe or a government or a beneficial organization, you want to bring resources into that business in a way that strengthens the mothership, that strengthens the core entity. And so, um, as we're looking at like philanthropic grant opportunities for this, which is how it's grown to this point, we need to go after sources that aren't competing with One Fair Wage's just core general fundraising, right? Which sort of narrows the universe of possible places you can go because if there's a grant that can go into general support for One Fair Wage, that's where we'll send it. That's where it should go. So we're kind of then narrowed down to the funders who have specific grant resources or debt resources that are very aligned with this more narrow purpose of a community or social enterprise being generated for to support revenue generation or asset building to the benefit of communities, to the benefit of workers, right? Um, so that's, I think, just one of the dynamics in the sort of raise process. But there that money exists. It's just not as plentiful as money for general purpose.
Mhm.
Yeah, in relationship to the sort of next tier of things that we turn to, I'll just like call the T25 tier. So if people know T25, Transformative 25. It's a network of about 100 funds now that have all been recognized for kind of innovative finance models for just transition, for community wealth building, for worker wealth building. And those things are often created by, like, if Saro created a fund to do all this stuff, it would be a T25 fund. They're funds that are created by folks who often are coming out of a community context, coming out of a worker context,
Mhm.
um, and they're going out to raise money to like expand or increase worker ownership. Or so we sort of started with our friends there to be like, hey, you all have already raised some money for social enterprises like this. Is this a fit for you? And that's kind of the next place that we go. So, the terms of the capital needed are like, we're looking for 0 to 5% debt, a few $1 million of that, which is what we would ideally like to bring in. The financial model works such that if we have to bring in debt at like 7 to 10%, the model still works. But um, when you bring in debt at a higher percentage, it puts a little more pressure on the revenue projections. You have to meet your marks. You have to um, You have to meet your projections on your revenue growth. And it sort of can delay the time that it takes to get to sustainability and profitability. So yeah, but that's the it's pretty simple in that regard. But the challenge is, and the sort of our core principle in all of the work that we do in full spectrum with both folks who are providing capital and that folks who are raising capital, whatever kind of capital that is that it's really important for the people who are raising to be clear what kind of money they want and need and what kind of money they don't want and need. And when you're having conversations with folks who are providing money, don't spend much time with people who don't have the money that you need because they're
Hmm.
expecting much higher returns or I mean, yeah, we had an experience with one potential lender who met Saru and they got really excited and inspired about the work that they were doing and this Just.Safe Foods, and then we sort of spent some time with them and looked a little bit about um, some of the lending they do. And after a few conversations, it was like, oh, you only lend into post Series A startups, which is like uh,
Not there yet.
businesses that already have like $1 million or more in annual revenue. So we spent probably more time than we should have early on with them, and in reality, it wasn't a waste of time because they're they were so excited they were like, well, maybe we can sort of bend our rules and
Hmm.
kind of make an exception because this is such a unique um, project, and they're very clear that once the business gets to a certain stage, they're going to be really excited to come in and bring resources. So those conversations aren't necessarily a waste, but I do think I do observe that they often are because people do spend a lot of time talking to folks who really there's really no chance that they're ever going to deliver any resources into the business or the project. And
Hmm.
so yeah, that's the sort of behavior pattern system that we're most trying to interrupt on both sides of the equation.
Hmm. So is there something different you do in the outreach, in the storytelling to make sure that there is alignment in terms of the type of capital upfront? What is that change in vetting the opportunity or the change in how you pitch? What does that look like for different types of capital?
Yeah, so we kind of have two ways to do that. So I put a link earlier in the chat to the Blueprint platform, and that's a place where if you're raising money, you can say this is what we're raising,
Hmm.
these are the terms that we're raising on. So if I send someone to the Just Say Foods Blueprint link, there'll be accurate information on the terms. So part of this is to, again, oftentimes it's like you might get introduced to a potential donor, investor, or lender, and then after the third conversation, you get to the terms. And what we kind of think is it's a better use of everyone's time if you know on the front end what those terms are. So you don't initiate conversations in which the gap is too far apart. So and pretty early on in the deck, we lay out what the capital needs are, and so folks can take a look and see if it might be a fit for them. So those are sort of two ways we're trying to make that process more time efficient for everybody.
Awesome. Ben, anything to add there?
I think Taj covered it.
Okay. I couldn't tell if that was like thinking face or
Just interesting stuff, you know.
very interesting. So I want, we have a little bit of time left, and before we hand it over to the audience for Q&A, I really wanted to give you both the opportunity to talk about, what do you think the movement lessons are that everyone, both the movement frontline leaders as well as our partners in philanthropy, people who are doing impact investing, what are the key lessons that you want them to walk away with about um, capital continuum, about supporting multi-entity work, to get to a point of economic liberation. What do you think that people in our ecosystem need to know to help us grow to this next phase?
Yeah, part of the learning for me, in kind of moving into this full spectrum work is like, I sort of think about things generally through like a values lens, a cultural lens, a political lens first. And I was not trained or oriented to sort of think about things through an economic lens as my primary way of understanding something. And both like the just transition movement helped me think about that in relationship to like what it means to move from an extractive to a regenerative economy. So that kind of built more of my capacity to look in that way. But then moving into full spectrum, one of the things that we do is to sort of think about like how do we understand the problems that we're trying to solve as economies? And one of the best examples for this is like mass incarceration, right?
Hmm.
Mass incarceration is an economic system.
Yes.
And that includes both the public parts of the system, the economy of mass incarceration, and the private parts of the economy of mass incarceration. And if we said, okay, if we want a different kind of economy, let's call it the community health and safety economy, the economy that at scale can produce and reproduce financially and politically and otherwise community health and safety, right? Then you look at, well, what is funding the mass incarceration economy? Because it's a mix of both private capital and philanthropic capital and public capital. And what could you do to cut off the sources of capital, starve the mass incarceration economy for sources of capital, and then redivert those sources of capital into the community health and safety economy? So I learned the most about this from my sister, Christina Hollenbeck, who leads Justice Capital and has a whole kind of economic framework for this transition that she's been moving, amongst other things, through the work at Justice Capital. So that's a really good example because oftentimes people think about the legal criminal system as primarily like a political system or a moral system as opposed to just a way that a lot of people make a lot of money. And the way that some people pay their mortgage, pay their rent, but it's an economy. So it's an economy that produces systematically a set of outcomes. So in this case, with Just Say Foods, Just Say Foods was providing serve safe trainings to their members, right? Because they didn't understand the economics of their opposition.
Hmm.
Like how is our opposition able to afford to spend all this money to suppress the wages of workers? Well, it turns out they're taking monies from workers to lobby to suppress their wages. So, so it's kind of it's a little bit of going a little deeper in opposition research of like, oh, who are the people who are profiting off of the problems that our communities are experiencing? And are there ways to both cut off the funding of that profiting off of our misery and divert that into our well-being, our sovereignty, our thriving, our worker power and community power and self-determination. So that I think is like broadly the just like a and I'm still doing it, but I sort of have to train myself to look at things that way because that's not
Hmm.
naturally the way I look at things. So, but
Right.
once you start looking at it, you're like, wow, our parks are a economy. Like some things are obvious, like oh, energy system, fossil fuels, solar panels. It's easy to like talk about the economics of the transition from renewable energy to or
Right.
from fossil fuels to renewables. But anyway, I'll pause there. That's the big mindset shift, I think.
And just to,
Ben, what
just
about you?
to yeah, to build on that, I think there's this concept of when people are brainstorming, let's say what business they want to build for their organization, they're doing movement work. I think you'll often think of it in terms of we want this to be sort of mission aligned. We want this to sort of be an outreach or an outgrowth of the stuff we naturally do. And that's totally valid, right? But I think Just Say Food, it's not exactly mission aligned, it's mission adjacent. And I think
Mm.
that's an important distinction. And the more we learn, the more we realize it kind of is mission aligned, which is great. But it's at the end of the day, we're teaching people how to, like Sarah said, wash their hands effectively, know when to come into work, learn about workplace hazards. And we're offering, we're by the way, we're sneaking in some training on workers' rights, which is great. We're sharing resources that are publicly available. But we found an opportunity to tap into one of these big economic systems, the food system restaurant value chain, right? And
Yep.
so I think if you limit yourself to just looking at how can I take, let's say, my advocacy and monetize it, it's going to be hard.
Hmm.
And if you start by looking at where do I have a competitive advantage, what is mission adjacent, you can often back into something that's mission aligned. Yeah.
Absolutely. Going a little deeper on the mission adjacent piece, one of the questions that I saw in the chat was a curiosity about the entity and ownership structure when you have usually, C3, C4, sometimes a pack, and then you throw in a for-profit structure. Tell me how you approach navigating that.
Yeah, I think the cool and interesting thing about One Fair Wage is they already have a complex multi-entity structure. So, some organizations are like, oh, we have a 501(c)(3) and we want to do some lobbying. So we're going to create a 501(c)(4) and then we're going to create a PAC. And we have a C3 and a C4 PAC little combination. Or we're going to incubate a little business as an LLC and then the nonprofit's going to be the owner of the business, or you can sort of arrange the parts in various ways. And part of what and we call that multi-entity formation, and we spend a lot of time in Full Spectrum helping our partners to build multi-entity formations. Like
Hmm.
you've got a nonprofit, create a for-profit, you've got this and a that and the other things. And we're going to use a community advised fund DAF as your fund structure. And so you might end up with three or four different legal entities that are all like connected to each other. So, and the arrangement of those entities has to do with like their purpose. And in this case, um, the way that sort of the ownership relationships are structured is that there's sort of a mechanism within One Fair Wage that is there to sort of resources come back into that mechanism and then they sort of get redirected into different purposes. Some of those purposes are just like, hey, we need more money to do more organizing. So some of the core central core purpose is to create a revenue stream for the core organizing work of One Fair Wage that gives the organization more durability, more flexibility, more capacity. Where okay, foundation fundraising is up this year, it's down this year, it's up this year, but you have your own revenue that can kind of
Hmm.
maintain a steady budget and capacity through the ups and downs of foundation whims or whatever,
Hmm.
which we all, if you're in the nonprofits, you know that those dynamics well. So right now the ownership's all held, basically by the nonprofit. We're not giving up equity to any other entity. There's a few other entities that are going to have some fractional ownership relationships, but they're sort of like other nonprofits. The the structure that we are quite fond of is the purpose trust, which if you don't know what a purpose trust is, you should remember when the U.S. military said to Anthropic, like, "Hey, we want you to help us do all these things," and like Anthropic said no. Well, the only reason they were able to say no is because Anthropic has a purpose trust. And it's a thing that it's a structure that kind of um, protects purpose and allows you to say no to the U.S. military if you want to, but really that's about saying no to like shareholder pressure, because or fiduciary pressure to shareholders that like if doing what the U.S. military wants you to do is going to make us money, therefore, as your shareholders, we insist that you do it. And the
Hmm.
purpose trust kind of is this protective layer that helps with that. So that's both a little bit of how it's set up now. I think that the yeah, there's some other kind of evolutions of the ownership structure that are kind of anticipated. There's some ways that it could go in some interesting ways because um, when you think about in a traditional union organization, when you have members who pay dues, how are those dues governed and allocated um, for the well-being of the membership, for the members in their communities. And you can think about like the revenue when a food worker pays for a certification, it's not dues, they're buying a service, but we sort of think about it through the lens of dues, right? Like they're paying dues into the organization, and in exchange for those dues, as an individual worker and as a class of workers, this set of entities need to deliver a set of benefits. The primary benefit being like a significant increase in wages for all
Yes.
workers in this class at a certain point. Like that is what the money is for, like to raise the minimum wage for all workers. That is its
Hmm.
purpose. So it is ownership is structured in a way to make sure that resources go towards that purpose for the benefit
Yes.
of the class of workers.
I think that one of the biggest lessons that we try to teach is that, capital does what it's designed to do, and that we have to make sure that that the capital alignment to what we actually needed to do, like raise wages, is the critical first step in deciding what revenue generation tactic is right, whether that is simple fundraising tests or something complex like enterprise building. Ben, anything you'd like to add in terms of what's the big lesson moment for you at this time before we open it up for Q&A?
I'd love to hear the questions from the audience. I know we got some also ahead of time.
All right. If anybody would like to ask a question of our panelists, you should be able to use the raise hand function, or feel free to also put your question in the chat and we will monitor that way as well. While we wait for hands to be raised or things to get added into the chat here, I'll go with some of the ones that people had put in their registration. Um, to both of you, what is the place in this journey where things felt too expensive or too risky at the time, but was a necessary sort of moment of faith in the enterprise building?
We had to make some big early investments in product. The on the one hand, what we're doing is quite simple. On the other hand, there's a lot of pieces that go into instructional design. And for instance, in different states, there are different, food safety regulations, and sometimes it's just a matter of opinion, and the recommended, degree is one half degree off. So we had to do some really, and we continued to do some really extensive analysis of the regulations, of the accreditation requirements, of data ownership rules around how we're actually getting this information out, and who owns, what happens with privacy, right? Once we get someone's information. So there's a lot of questions early on that felt like distractions,
Mm.
but really were absolutely critical. And taking that extra month to do that thinking, to really look at all the options out there, consult people in our network, who sometimes knew more than us, I think really paid off.
Great, I appreciate that. Another question that we had was, what should philanthropy be willing to fund before there's revenue to report? So obviously there are funds like Progressive Multiplier where we are assuming the R&D stage, but obviously when we finished, there wasn't revenue to report yet. So what is there the gap there that philanthropy could be called into? What pieces could they fund of this work?
Yeah, I think from what you just said, like Katali and a few others, like funded from like at the end of the R&D stage when there was sort of a pilot product,
Hmm.
a proven pilot product. Um, so from R&D to uh, product update and business launch, right? Which is kind of what the next round
Yep.
of philanthropic resources kind of got us to. Yeah, and again, like I'll put the link to the um blueprint profile and for Just Say Foods. You can kind of see
Oh,
a
perfect. Thank
snapshot
you.
of kind of what the numbers look like and how
Hmm.
that shows up on Blueprint. But yeah, we're at this point, like with the money that needs to come in, if it comes in all as debt, we'll be fine. If it comes in half debt, half grants, we'll be fine. Like, and again, as I said before, um, sort of philanthropic capital is the grant money is like the things that accelerate things the fastest, and it gets us to community and worker ownership the fastest, and it protects community and worker ownership. So like that's the power of a grant dollar versus a grant dollar is an investment with a negative 100% financial return to the investor.
Hmm.
0% is 100% return to the investor. You give me a dollar, I give you a dollar back. That's a 0% loan. So anything from the negative 100 to zero continuum, um, that money has a multiplying effect within the spreadsheet.
Yes,
Astronomically, like it is it exponentially. So it's yeah, that's always best. And I think, for philanthropists who donors and philanthropists who um, are especially trying to help groups think about more sustainability in an environment in which the public resource environment, especially the federal government for sure, but as the economy is going through what it's going through, just resources are just becoming more and more unstable and unpredictable. A lot of organizations merging, shutting down, really struggling to raise money. And so it's always useful to think about how philanthropic resources can be used to help your grantees buy a building, help your grantees create their own endowment, help your grantees generate revenue generation. That's
hmm
always a good idea, but I think it's going to be increasingly like an imperative in the next little while, because if you don't encourage your grantees to think about some of those strategies and pursue some of those, like there's not going to be sustained philanthropic resources to keep these organizations around. So yeah, I think that's something for folks to consider.
I appreciate that. And I'm seeing a couple questions in the chat that we are unfortunately at time, and we will make sure to answer those questions as part of the emails that we send out tomorrow. But want to thank our panelists, Saru, Tosh, and Ben, and everyone who joined us today. I hope that you're taking away from this conversation that independent revenue generation is not something we need to be doing off the sides of our desks. It's actual real enterprise building. And Taj, I think you ended us well in saying that it is imperative in the current landscape. So um, the larger lesson for us in the movement is that if we want to build durable revenue, we have to invest in the full cost of building it. And hopefully today's panel gave you some idea as to what those full costs encompass. So thank you again. You will be receiving that email with the recording from today, as well as a couple of different case studies. And please stay tuned. We will be launching our learning report from Progressive Multiplier, publishing our first 5 years of learning with groups like One Fair Wage and about 200 other groups that we have worked with. So look for that later this summer, and the hard launch of our Convergence resource library online. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And we appreciate you being here and all the work that you do. Take care.